ideas or even points that you liked about what you heard here. Okay, we'll start in this Mustafa.
Hi, Mustafa Almi, the IPCRI co-chairman, along with my Israeli partner at the back, Gershon, and a very good friend of mine, the co-chairman and founder of Peacemaking. First of all, I'd like to thank Ariel, Gary, Dahlia, and Aziz for coming for these fascinating presentations. Thank you so much for agreeing to come. My question is simple to articulate, yet very complex probably to answer, and I gave Gary a head start. What will the impact be of BRIC exit on the Good Friday Agreement? What are the opportunities, if any? What are the clear threats?
There's a PhD thesis in there, which I will not unpack tonight. I voted to remain with my wife, and I did that, and I think it was important. I think for a number of reasons, because in Ariel's presentation, the phrase British, Irish, etc., etc. I think as life has evolved, and I'll come to your question, but I think as life has evolved after the Good Friday Agreement. I had a good friend, Francis Campbell, there a few weeks ago in Belfast. Francis was the former British ambassador to the Vatican. He's currently Vice Pro-Chancellor at St Mary's University of London, doing a lecture on identity in a complex, changing world. So if you ask me today, how do I define myself nationalistically? I would say I'm Northern Irish, I'm also British, I'm also European. So identity is an incredibly complex thing. The concern about Brexit is, for some people on the right, it has become a very nationalistic concept, and that is a concern. I mean, the European Union have played a very strategic role in our peace process. Most folk don't know this, but we have had 4 blocks of peace money. Peace 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in the 1990s, literally every group in Irish society that asked for money got that money. So that was what I would call very grassroots encounter. Small women's groups, Catholic, Protestant, dialoguing, understanding, listening, debating. And we moved to Peace 2 and Peace 3. I mean, it was Peace 3 that helped me develop the Skenos project. A Special European Union Projects Board gave me $9–10 million towards that project. So the concern as regards Peace 4, which is sitting on a shelf somewhere in Brussels, could Brexit mess that up? So it is a concern. I think again, but there was no real rational thought and debate around that. I think David Cameron also made a mistake in relation to even going down that line in the first place. But I think the other thing in relation to David Cameron was, in relation to the elections last year in the UK, there was a tendency for some people within the Conservative Party to slightly play a nationalistic card, particularly in relation to Scottish independence. So my analysis of this is, and I'm saying this quite openly, is you can't play that 1 week and then 3 weeks later be all touchy-feely towards Europe. To quote the Christian scriptures, if you don't mind me doing that, there's a little verse where it says a double-minded person is unstable in all their ways. So there was a little bit of double-mindedness playing around in that political world. It really is a wait and see. There have been court cases, as you know, in Belfast, and friends of mine have spearheaded in relation to Brexit. So I think really the next 6 to 10 months are going to tell a tale. Whether or not it can be revoked, I just don't know. But I'm hoping that in it all, the borders are not restored again, which would really be very difficult for our peace process.
Thank you, Gary. Someone else? No, you want to?
I can speak without the mic. I don't know if you hear me. Yeah. Okay.
Can you please stand?
Stand. Well, Liel doesn't want us to give big speeches, but I come from the traditional peace-building community, and for the past years, and also Gary, we've come with various religious groups to visit in Northern Ireland. And what happens often, I just want to dig deeper into the issue of including religious narratives and religious leaders, because what happens is that the traditional peace camp articulates very well, we want to include religious leaders, we need, you know, the spoilers. And then when we listen to panels and we listen to secular, very traditional peace builders, they're actually complaining and they're saying how the religion again is the obstacle, and the religious constituencies are the obstacles. And I'm doing work with a lot of religious constituencies, and I'm hearing a lot of healthy narratives, and I'm hearing a lot of allies that are just not coming out with their narratives because of this nature of the liberal camp to exclude and exclude. And my question is targeted specifically to Gary, but please comment, all of you, how do we deal with this? That there are allies from within, you know, religious communities who are very legitimate to big constituencies, but they cannot come out because of the liberal camp that is tagged. And we're seeing panels where people speak about religious leaders, but there are no religious leaders around the table. And also, just if you can touch on religious fragmentation, because as you know, the Jewish leadership in Israel, it's very fragmented. You have the ultra-Orthodox and then the religious nationalists, and the power, the politics within the religious leadership also shifts all the time. And what can you kind of comment about that as well? Because I think this is the most dominant obstacle that we face as peace builders who are trying to bring narratives of religion into the peace process. Sorry, it was a two-part long question.
Thank you, Noam.
This works a bit easier. Let me just use an umbrella phrase there. Initially, it's from John Sachs, who's the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth. Sachs says religion has power. Power, P-O-W-E-R, it's that Irish accent. And whatever is power can be used, misused, and abused. Okay? And he continues on and he uses the phraseology, religion is like fire. It warms, but also burns. And we are the guardians of that flame. So there's no question about it. I mean, religion is a very, as you say, very, very powerful mechanism. Last year, I was at a conference I was speaking at York University, and a young Japanese professor was giving me a lecture on something I'd never heard of, and I don't think anyone else in the room, the rise of Shinto nationalism in Japan. And my politics about Asia are zilch, but just even hearing that for the first time. But she said this quotation. She said, an incomprehensible act becomes comprehensible when told in conjunction with religion. Look at this again. An incomprehensible act becomes comprehensible when told in conjunction with religion. Let me illustrate that in our context. And it wasn't a religious war, as Dahlia said, but what I call toxic theology or bad theology fed into it. The point here about dealing with the other. So, for example, a very close friend of mine now, whom I've worked with extensively over 15 to 20 years, said to me once, Gary, when you were taught Catholics were shit in religious Sunday school, it was much easier to kill them. Okay? So as one Jewish theologian said, dehumanization precedes genocide. So while this person who said this quotation about killing Catholics was not a card-carrying religious person, toxic religion or abusive religion had shaped their worldview. They were not going out to kill the person because of their religious identity, but bad, extreme religion shaped this person's ideology. So I think, first of all, we need to hear that. As regards those differences, Noam, I mean, this phrase of republicanism, Sinn Féin's phrase of uncomfortable conversations is absolutely key. And I think sometimes we're very, very difficult at that. We ignore the big issues. I mean, I often illustrate it like this, if you bear with me for a moment. Suppose a couple come to either of us for therapy, okay? And we know in this marriage marriage, in this relationship, that there's some domestic abuse. And we take a 6-week short-term counselling, and everything is mentioned apart from the domestic abuse. So the woman says, oh, he drops his socks on the floor, and he never takes out the trash, and he's always late for his dinner. But we don't mention the domestic abuse. What will happen is that couple will go away unhappy. And sometimes I think within the more liberal peace world, if you don't mind me saying this, we ignore sometimes the major issues. And religion is a major issue. Again, to quote Jonathan Sachs, Sachs said, weapons win wars, but ideas win peace. And as I kind of look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the moment, if you don't mind me being a critical friend, to use our Irish phraseology, there's a bit of a dearth of ideas about the way forward. So I think it's time for some very creative thinking, joined up thinking. I think it's time for that multidisciplinary approach that I talk about, where everyone is at the table. I think that's going to be crucial. And I think religious people need to be in there to allow that framework. It'll be stormy, it'll be difficult, but I mean, one of the things of bringing in Sinn Féin, and I've said this to me privately, but also now quite openly, when people began to treat us as human beings, we were able to move forward. And I've often said, the narratives are different here between Israelis and Palestinians, as they are with Unionists and Nationalists or Republicans. But again, one of the key words is understanding. I want to understand the narrative. And I just think that is crucial. To humanize and understand the narrative allows people, I think, to move forward considerably. Let's hear from some other folk here.
I think as more people become religious, as Dahlia mentioned, it is not up for liberals to bring or not bring religious people in the conversation. They are the ones that will eventually be part of this conversation, and I think it's time for them to lead it. And when I look, I live in Washington, D.C. now, and when I look at the U.S. example, it was religious leaders who justified slavery. It was religious leaders who justified segregation. It was those same leaders who told Martin Luther King Jr. that you should not involve religion and politics, and you should not be involved in the civil rights movement because you are a religious leader, not a political leader, while on the other hand, pushing for continuation of it. And yet, he did not wait for the liberals, whoever they were, to lead. He was the one who said, I don't care what your opinion is, this is my responsibility and I'm gonna do it. And if you're not gonna join me, that is your choice. And looking at how things are moving here, I think we need to start looking at where are the religious leaders who can do that? Who are the ones who will say, regardless of the liberals will accept it or not, we will have to take in charge of this. This is our country as much as it is their country.
This is sort of in addition to, or maybe a little bit of a dialogue with what you guys are saying. I like, Jonathan Sachs and I do very much respect, but the quote that he said, what was it about arms win wars, but ideas win peace? Weapons win wars, but ideas win peace. I have to take issue with that. I mean, communism and fascism were ideas too, so was Nazism. So I would be careful with that. In fact, I think that part of the problem with what's traditionally considered the peace camp is that they are perceived as lacking emotion. There are too many ideas. This idea of peace, this rational, you will get some future peaceful situation, you'll have a better economic life. Those are like very rational kind of justifications for taking big emotional risks and big emotional concessions as well. And I think that to some extent, at least certainly in this region, the peace camp is seen, is perceived as people who don't get the spirit, don't get the fear, don't get the passion of the religious passion.
So they love Arabs.
Yeah, that's right. That's the accusation, right? Which, by the way, I don't take it as an accusation. I'm proud of it. And this brings me to the my answer when you started raising your question, which is like, how can the peace camp, which sort of purports to invite in religious people, actually, be welcoming and be genuine about it when they do bring them in? And I think that we have two wonderful tools for doing that. One is here, and the other is here. In other words, people are not listening enough. And I think that there's a real lack of self-criticism, not in terms of our countries. Yeah, Left-wingers know how to criticize their own society everywhere in the world. Right-wingers know how to criticize left-wingers. But people are not self-critical about their own communities. It's not that, people sometimes say to me, oh, it must be so hard to be critical of Israeli society and be on the left. And you know what? No, it's not hard for me at all. But it is hard for me to look very genuinely at the people who I'm supposed to agree with and say, we haven't done this right. We haven't really been listening to religious narratives enough. We have not understood where we ignore the elephant in the room sometimes, security issues, for example, and it's not helping our cause. So I think that certainly, the right has their own problems that I think that they're doing wrong, but really they have to come to that realization too. And I think that what's really lacking, certainly in our region and probably in many others, is a sense of humility and self-criticism for real. Maybe we're not doing something right in advancing the causes we claim to stand for. So lately I've been trying to think of all these kinds of forums. How can each particular subgroup be a little more self-critical of their own before they start criticizing everybody else?
Thank you. Gershon, you want to comment on this? I see you're very passionate.
I have a question about who's supposed to do what. About 10 years ago, I think it was, I don't remember exactly when, we hosted Jerry Adams in this room with a group of Israeli and Palestinian peace activists. We spent an evening sitting around the table listening to Jerry Adams describe how they would go out, he and Sinn Féin and his folks would go out every night into the countryside and reach out to those people that they wanted to bring into the room who were opposed to the process. And he described very vividly how they took responsibility for bringing in their own extremists. Very much to the point of what Noam was saying about we in Israel needing to talk to our communities of religious people and non-religious people and people in extreme groups. On the Palestinian side, it's very much someone needs to decide how to bring in Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other extreme groups. And the question is, and maybe Aziz, you relate to this a little bit, is there a possibility of the crossover? Can Israelis talk to the extremist on the Palestinian side? Can Palestinians talk to the extremist on the Israeli side? Or is it solely the responsibility of each community within? When I spoke to Abu Mazen several times on this issue of Hamas and talking to Hamas, his response was always, give me the tools to make Hamas a Palestinian problem. Hamas is not an Israeli problem, it's a Palestinian problem. Give me the tools to empower me to legitimize the work that I want to do for peace so that I can bring in the extremists. So I'm really looking at our situation here on both sides and saying who really needs to do this work, who can be most competent at doing it, who can have the greatest success in doing it. And from, of course, the Northern Ireland or other conflict and experiences.
This is the easiest question. It's a tough one. I think, I don't like the idea of monopoly saying, well, I only can talk to my own community and nobody else can bring them. I'm actually not sure that is actually true. I think it depends on each situation, it will be different. 10 years ago, I was working with the Bereaved Families Forum. And I remember going with people like Ramit Hanan to speak in refugee camps in Bethlehem and Ramallah, even in Jenin. And I found it much more effective back then that Rami was speaking to them about how his daughter was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber and how he has become a peace activist and how he wants to reach out to them than me going alone. So it's not always really that simple of saying, well, me alone as Palestinian can talk to Palestinians and you alone as Israeli can talk to Israelis. And I've seen it the same also with Israelis who, when my liberal Israeli friends will go to talk to them, they'll say, yeah, but the Palestinians would never agree with you. And only when somebody like me would go and have a conversation with them, then they kind of, well, sometimes they'll say, yeah, but then there's only one Palestinian who's different. But it's still able to give them a proof that that's not true. So I think we have to work together to figure out where that's happening, and we need a lot more of these kind of approaches that are not happening enough today.
Just a quick thing. I think that it's probably not a wise idea to leave it, to assume that it only has to be internal, because from the other conflicts that I'm thinking about, they don't do it very well. In other words, I'm thinking about South Africa, where for the sake of internal unity during the anti-apartheid struggle, there were informers who were killed. Violence was very common. Certainly in Kosovo during the phase of political consolidation, they held elections, but they were considered very non-democratic. People complained that the political authority that was trying to compete for political power was essentially repressive, and leading to a government now that is very corrupt and undemocratic. And I think that puts into place a mentality of we have to control our people at all costs, and therefore sacrificing the kinds of norms that you would want in place to build a better society after the conflict. So it could be the case. I'm just not sure if there's a formula, really. I think it might be wise to say I don't know. Sometimes there may be internal dialogues that will work, but I would be cautious of assuming that's the only way, because they sometimes do it badly. And then, of course, spontaneous interactions with the other side sometimes are more realistic, because the problem of sensing that your own so-called people are not loyal sometimes looks worse to a particular kind of person in conflict than the other side themselves. So I would just say that I don't know if there's any formula. I would say leave it all open. There's some parts of human relations that we really can't control or predict.
I think really, Gershon, I was saying it's not either or, it's both and. I mean, so it was one of the things we did as clergy in the early days, meeting with Sinn Féin and being perfectly honest about it, was to make sure Gerry Adams wasn't lying.
Wasn't what, sorry?
Wasn't telling lies.
Telling lies.
What? Well, everyone tells lies, because we're all into propaganda. I was saying at a meeting yesterday, as I look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the moment, it's an absolute propaganda feast. That's what it is. It's a propaganda feast in so many ways. So it is. So we all within our constituencies have our propaganda. But that then Sinn Féin also put together what they call a unionist outreach team, because they wanted to get to know unionists better. So there was lots of cross-fertilisation. I've often said, Gershon, sort of humorously over the years, if you lock 40 men in a room, listening to their own reassuring voices, it's a recipe for disaster. So we really need outside voices speaking into those worlds. And I would often say presenting alternatives. Because I think sometimes when people are involved in political violence, there are times they don't see alternatives. So I guess it's back again to that multidisciplinary approach. We all need to be at the table.
If I could just tack on sure what. We're dealing with real conflict here where there's violence and people get killed and people get hurt. So when I'm talking about doing this, we're talking about dangerous acts for Palestinians, not Aziz, but for Palestinians to go and dialogue in a settlement endangers them within their own community. I've been arrested many times and interrogated by the police for talking to Hamas when I was talking about negotiating Israeli soldier release. So when we first started doing this years ago, talking to the PLO was illegal. We broke the law in doing it. And to ask a broader number of people in the community to do it, to put themselves at physical danger, is something that we have to consider. Now, I know in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, this was the case. It was illegal to talk. Not Sinn Féin that was legitimized, but to talk to the military folks. And those are the people in Hamas we need to talk to, for an example. And it's dangerous, illegal, and etc. So I'm wondering how do we do this in these really life and death situations? It's not
yourself, I'm not going to tell, and the difficulty sometimes I think is outsiders coming in telling what Israelis and Palestinians need to do. We suffered from that in the early days in Ireland, particularly, and to my American friends here, coming in with something into situations and very complex and difficult. It's a bit like I've always said, it's a bit, you talk about gun control in the United States, and when you talk to those people, if I come with a very simplistic view around it, they're saying, well, you don't understand, it's very confusing and complex. And I'm saying to them, well, if that's confusing and complex, don't be telling me how to resolve the Irish situation. So I think it's a conversation that needs to take place here, but I do think, Gershon, strategic risks are important. And I think in talking to Adams, you were talking to the IRA. Because people, Gerry Adams has led the IRA despite his denials, for decades. So we knew who we were talking to in relation to that. But it was trying to create new beginnings, new accountability.
know that Aziz needs to leave, and I want to receive the comments and Ariel. So for now, I want to thank Aziz. Okay, we leave us, and we continue with less comments and Ariel's answer, and then we close. Sorry. Thank you very much, Aziz.
Sorry.
I just wanted to say quickly about your question. In Northern Ireland, two issues. First, the consensus building process that Jerry Adams probably referenced to, which also occurred on the Protestant side as well within those militant groups.
He also hosted David Trumbull within Israeli Palestinians.
Okay. So the militant organizations went on very deliberate efforts for a couple years to bring their people along. But this was only after the leadership had decided to change, to make a change. In terms of the leadership themselves, the change agents were, for a very large role, were the ex-prisoners on both sides that pushed for a new strategy, for a new nonviolent strategy to be explored. And the ex-prisoners also got to know each other. So you had enemy ex-prisoners with the credibility behind them meeting when other regular people couldn't meet across the line with them.
We'll take now all the comments together, and then we get the comments. Hillel, and then Emmanuel. Amit, okay. Three of you, and even then, okay.
First of all, I found these presentations very illuminating, particularly given the fact that the next issue of the Palestine Israel Journal will be devoted to what lessons can Israelis and Palestinians learn from the Irish peace process. Now, I and my co-editor, Palestinian co-editor, Aziz Abu Sarah, were in Belfast and Dublin 2 months ago. And everywhere we went, we heard this is not a Catholic Protestant conflict, this is Republicans and loyalists or unionists. And now at the same time, you talked about the role of religion, Gary, and what I wanted to know is to what degree were religious leaders, Catholic and Protestant religious leaders, actually central change agents involved in moving the process forward? And for Dahlia, who also related to that, it is unfortunately very hard at this moment to see religious leadership on either the Jewish or the Muslim side taking a central role. We have to relate to the Jewish religious and Muslim religious themes, particularly on the Israeli side of the themes, but the leadership, I unfortunately don't see that happening.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
Okay, I wanted to relate to what Gershon said before. I think the two demographics which can be really important to bring the extremists in is, first of all, the religious, because on both sides they're closest to the extremists. And they have legitimacy vis-a-vis the extremists, and they have legitimacy vis-a-vis each other. So I think it's crucial that they become part of it. And the other demographic is women. Women are not brought in for some reason on a major scale. There's a big movement or a growing movement in Israel now, which is also in the Palestinian Authority to some extent. And if more of them are brought in, this will also help calming the situation down and bring in more people to talk.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
Oh, I have a lot of things that came up for me just now. I was this Sunday in Beit Umar, right? Just meeting with people, with little organizations there. And I said, well, what do you think about what Ali does? I wish that Aziz was still here, because it seems like it's a similar sort of thing where you're trying to have people really meet that are, and you know what Ali Abu Awad does with the settlers meeting with the Palestinians. So I say to the other people in the village, well, how do you feel about it? And everybody else in the village is against it because they say it's normalization and they don't want to meet with the settlers. And if I said, well, if you can't, if you don't meet with them, you're never going to get out of this situation. You have to sit and listen to them. So that's just one thing that, it's not like, let's say Rabbi Melchior, I think he's the most outspoken Orthodox voice for peace in this country. Maybe I'm wrong, but he stands out for me because he's really Orthodox and he's focusing on values in the religion. But all the settler rabbis, except for Froman, who's gone, there is like the number one mitzvah is the land, you know, that we have to control the land. And so, you know, Rabbi Melchior, I want to amplify his voice. I don't know how to get, it's like religion, Jewish religion at least, it's a factor, but it's really about nationalism, and like the religion is like the sort of the excuse or the justification, but you don't, if you're a religious Jew, it doesn't mean that we have to be in control of the land, because Froman was willing. I'm just saying all these things that just came up for me now. And I did go, actually, the Bayit organization, they had a thing in June with 12 panelists, including 3 settler rabbis, with like a sheikh, and it was very interesting. The religious people were there. The settler rabbis had their guns, you know, and they were saying, well, we'll give you all human rights, but it's our land. I'm just like really losing hope. That's all I have to say. I want hope. Mejdi gives me hope. Ali gives me hope. But the vast majority aren't listening. And the dual narrative book was written 10 years ago. The dual narrative curriculum, and the Israelis don't use it, and the Palestinians don't use it, and it's there for everyone to see, and the whole world can read it except us. So I don't have a question. I'm just throwing out some of the things that arose.
It's okay, I'm sure that you touched many things that people feel in this room.
Again, thank you very much for all these insights. I was just wondering if we can highlight a little bit more about the role of women in the North Ireland conflict as well.
Okay, now I am conscious of time, and there's a multiplicity of areas there to put it in the highlight. I mean, go back to the religion thing again, good and bad. I mean, I remember in the early 1970s, a rally in a park very near where I lived, and a person made a speech about liquidating the enemy, and religious leaders were on the platform when that speech took place. So as a person said to me, a person who's now dead, his name was Billy, he said, when I heard that speech, it lit a fire within me. And it was not the fire of good religious spirituality, it was the fire of religious sectarianism. He went out and murdered 2 Catholics. So the courage of religious leaders is crucial as well. And I do still feel that religious leaders can take risks that politicians can't. I've seen that over 30 years, but just in your own context there, and I am not putting myself forward as an expert on this region, but I do know within some of the ultra-Orthodox, particularly some of those within Shas, that the late Rabbi Yosef's statement, where he said the sanctity of life is more important than the sanctity of land, did allow a number of that constituency to move forward. I'm not saying all of them, but statements like that in the public space, while everyone may not agree with them, do allow conversation. And just this young lady at the back, just to allude to that whole concept of land, I know the argument theologically from the Torah that God has given us the land. But it also needs to be said that within the context of Judaism does not have the single ownership of that. Because that has been interpreted, particularly within Christendom, for example, when the Covenanters, there's a pretty Jewish word, Covenanters, Calvinists, came to Northern Ireland, they brought that concept of God gave us the land. But they didn't stop there. They went from the Irish context to the United States, and guess what? God gave us this land as well. But it didn't stop there. When the Dutch, the Boers, went to South Africa, guess what? God gave us the land. So it is a phenomenon, the whole concept of land. I mean, I could spend all night here talking about land and blood sacrifice. There's another concept and theory around that as well. So I mean, it is very evocative. The whole concept of of despair. I mean, my wife Joyce and I were here last October when the stabbings began, and within both communities, both Palestinians and Israelis, when we went back to Belfast, the word that was on our mind was the word you've just used, absolute despair. Wondering what is the way forward. And I think alluding there to just in relation to the whole sort of Jonathan Sachs quote, I think what he was trying to say was that we need some new thinking or maybe new ideas. And I think by new ideas, maybe some of the stuff that Noam was saying, maybe one idea that could maybe possibly being very action oriented, spill out of this tonight. You know, for some of your thinkers within the room, should you be redoubling your efforts to bring some of these religious people to the table? It may be just an idea tonight. Could you make it happen? Listen, it's your call.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I have anything really new to add about the question about religious leadership. You're right, whoever asked that. It is very unlikely that the way we see it, that there's going to be, in this region, that they're going to take the lead on this stuff. But I guess we can start by making those who may eventually have more moderate opinions on politics within the religious community feel more welcome and actually be listening to them, which is what I talked about before, because the next generation of leadership will eventually come. A word about the role of women. I'm sorry, I'm going to make you feel worse. I mean, in other words, women, I think that women should be integrally involved in peacemaking and everything else with relation to policy, and it's not only an Israeli movement, it's an international UN resolution, 1325, that has talked about bringing women into what they call inclusive security, which includes peacemaking. But I have to say that, again, in our conflict, as Helen knows, because we have a special issue about it, when you look at public opinion breakdowns, there is no real gender gap. Men and women really don't see this conflict very differently, which is surprising, and on certain questions maybe they do, but questions that go in both directions. So I don't think, other than the importance of having representation at these kinds of tables, I have a hard time saying that that's where that's what's going to make the big change. Certainly not at the political level. So maybe in peacemaking, just to have fresh ideas and new perspectives. But in general, when we look at women leadership, as in top leadership positions, prime ministers, presidents, unfortunately we don't have any more. We haven't expanded our sample over the last few weeks of women top leaders. But we tend to see that they don't really do any better or worse on peace and war than male leaders, which is a shame. But that does not negate the need to bring women in as much as possible for the sense of having society represented. Like as we know, if we leave groups out, they're not going to be represented in the process, and that leads to, the failure of those processes. So, in terms of having no hope, I guess I'm also not going to make you feel much better because, when you said I want more hope, I hear you. The problem is the world doesn't. I mean, the Earth didn't. Whoever created the Earth, he or she, didn't have that in mind always. Like we're not going to feel good about this. That's no reason to stop working towards what we think needs to change. That's the best I can say, and I think that's not necessarily helpful. But it is the reality. We have to keep moving ahead to change the situation because it's a wrongful situation, hope or no hope.
The women question, or I feel guilty I didn't answer that. 7-8 weeks ago, I spoke at the launch of a new movement called Women's Peace Tables. I'm happy to email that to you, which is another sort of global launch by actually a lady in Dublin and a professor from the East Coast of Canada. So that's another new movement. The Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland played a very key role. Many of you know Monica McWilliams, who's a good friend of mine. They brought a lot more to the table because we were a society dominated, just being honest, by aggressive alpha male politicians. And women were able to bring a way of doing dialogue that sometimes men simply are not capable of. And that is a fact. So it's another area you need to work at, you need to tease out, but it's crucial, absolutely crucial.
I agree with that too.
I just wanted to comment on the dialogues that you mentioned between settlers and Palestinians. And in Northern Ireland, there were many, many dialogue groups on the grassroots level. And what peace research shows is that a lot of that stuff does not scale up. It doesn't influence the decision makers. It might influence the people involved, maybe their families, most of the time not more than that. So I would suggest that the question be, who should do these meetings? Not necessarily anyone who just wants to. Maybe look for strategic relationships. The strategic conversations were very, very big in Northern Ireland in order to influence both public opinion and also the decision-making level.
I want to thank the speakers again. Just for ending, I want to say that we started these forums in order to bring people together, discuss different issues related to the conflict, and to get some insights from outside. And we try that each forum connects also to a program afterwards. And for example, this program that focused on lessons from Ireland, we're going to start now a program of organizations in Jerusalem, East and West, learning about Belfast more deeply, and even going to Belfast to meet with organizations over there. An idea that, or maybe a theme that I heard throughout the evening was the idea of inclusiveness. We spoke about it a lot, not only including extremists into the process, but also including their story, their terminology, their identity into our narrative. Aziz spoke about it, that we need to include new stories in how we see the reality. We cannot continue to see it in a very narrow framework. I can also say that Gary said that groups moved from violent actions into political actions because they saw it as more effective, more efficient, which means that they were included in some decision-making processes. There was a new framework that allowed them to find different actions, different options. They were included. Over there as well, there was a process of inclusion. And I really hope that we keep it in our mind how each one in their organizations, their work, can manage to do it more inclusive, can bring more people to the table, and then the impact will be a lot deeper. I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank again the speakers, and have a good evening.